When you understand that charity is more than just an outward act, it becomes a power that reshapes your life from the inside out. Charity in both Christian teaching and Islamic practice is deeply rooted in faith, a demonstration that what we hold in our hands is temporary, but what we release in honor of God becomes eternal. In Christian belief, giving is seen as an act of faith, a step out of comfort into trust. The Scripture declares that faith without works is dead, meaning that belief must be backed by action. When a believer gives, they are announcing to heaven and earth that they serve a God who multiplies seeds and sustains the giver. In Islam, zakat is not merely a suggestion but a divine obligation, a purification of wealth and a cleansing of the heart. The very word zakat comes from the root meaning purification and growth. The Muslim gives not only because it is commanded, but because it is a means to elevate the soul and express gratitude for what Allah has provided. When faith leads to giving, something supernatural is released. In Christian circles, it is believed that when you sow your seed, you are placing it into the hands of God, trusting that He will bring an increase. The same spiritual truth echoes in Sadaqah, voluntary giving in Islam, where it is believed that what is given for Allah's sake is never lost, but multiplied in blessings both seen and unseen. Charity becomes a visible declaration of invisible faith. It shows God and even your own heart that you do not worship wealth but the one who provides it. When a person gives freely, it breaks the chains of fear and greed. It breaks the lie that says, if I give, I will not have enough. Faith-filled giving says, I give because I know my source will never run dry. Charity shifts the heart from scarcity to abundance, from anxiety to trust. Christian teaching often speaks of giving as a test of obedience. When Jesus watched the widow give her 2 small coins, He praised her above all, not because of the amount, but because of her faith and total surrender. Islamic teachings speak of how zakat is the right of the poor and the wealth of the rich, meaning charity is not a favor but a duty of justice and spiritual alignment with divine order. When a believer fulfills zakat, they are testifying that their wealth is entrusted to them by Allah and must be shared with those in need. Giving becomes a rhythm of obedience. It's not just about kindness, it's about alignment with God's command. It's about walking in covenant with heaven. Charity is not accidental, it is intentional, structured, commanded, and powerful. There comes a moment in every person's life when they must decide whether they will walk by sight or by faith. When charity is seen as a burden, giving becomes mechanical, dry, and joyless. But when giving is seen as an act of faith and obedience, it becomes a spiritual weapon. Christian doctrine teaches that when you give, it shall be given back to you, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Islamic belief teaches that the one who gives in the path of Allah will find reward multiplied many times over. The believer who gives in faith is not losing but investing in eternity. Charity plants seeds in both the physical and spiritual realm. It opens doors no man can shut. It brings divine favor, mercy, and breakthrough. Charity as an act of obedience is not only vertical, directed towards God, but also horizontal, impacting humanity. In Christianity, the teaching is clear. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for Him. In Islam, the Prophet said that the one who relieves a burden from a believer, Allah will relieve a burden for them on the day of judgment. Giving becomes a bridge between the giver and the needy, a bridge between heaven and earth, a bridge between obedience and reward. A person who gives as an act of faith is stepping into a divine flow. They are aligning with the heart of God, who is described in both traditions as compassionate, merciful, and generous beyond measure. To give is to reflect His nature. To help the poor is to walk in His footsteps. Charity rooted in faith also transforms the character of the giver. When giving is driven by obedience, it disciplines the soul. It trains the heart to release what it wants to cling to. It aligns one's desires with divine will. Zakat is structured to remove stinginess and cultivate humility. Christian giving is designed to teach reliance on God rather than material security. The more one gives in obedience, the more they break the grip of selfishness. The act of giving becomes a declaration. I trust divine promise over earthly logic. When a believer gives not just from the hand but from the heart, they enter a higher dimension of spiritual growth. Charity is not just a reaction to need, it is a proactive expression of faith. It is a spiritual discipline that molds identity. It creates a lifestyle of constant dependence on divine supply. It places the giver under the covering of God's promise of provision. When faith fuels charity, giving becomes limitless because faith sees no limits. When obedience directs generosity, every act of giving becomes a step into deeper divine alignment. Charity becomes more than kindness, it becomes covenant. More than emotion, it becomes devotion. More than duty, it becomes destiny. There is a divine law written not just in Scripture, but in the fabric of the universe itself. A principle that transcends time, cultures, and religious traditions, declaring that when you give, something begins to move in the realm of the unseen. Both Christian giving and Islamic practices such as Zakat and Sadaqah teach that giving is not subtraction but multiplication. It is a spiritual investment that produces a return far greater than what was given. In Christian faith, it is often taught that what you sow, you shall reap, and not in the measure given, but in the measure multiplied by the hand of God. In Islam, it is taught that giving for the sake of Allah is like planting a seed that grows into a tree with countless fruits, each fruit containing seeds for more trees. This is not just generosity, it is a gateway to divine provision. When a believer understands that giving unlocks supply, fear loses its grip. Fear says, if I let go, I will lose. Faith says, if I let go, I will receive more than what I released. Giving is not a loss, it is a release that initiates a flow. A river only stays alive when it flows. The moment it stops, it becomes stagnant. Likewise, wealth that is held too tightly loses its blessing. But when given with faith, it becomes part of a divine circulation of abundance. In Christian circles, there is an understanding that when you give, heaven responds with overflow. In Islamic teaching, zakat is seen as a purifier that ensures wealth remains blessed and sustained by divine favor. A person who gives unlocks the door to provision that is not dependent on their job, circumstances, or economy, but on divine promise. Multiplication begins where obedience meets faith. When a person gives not out of pressure but out of trust in God's promises, the act becomes fertile soil for supernatural increase. Jesus spoke of giving and receiving multiplied blessings pressed down, shaken together, and running over. In Islam, it is said that charity does not decrease wealth, but increases it in ways that may not always be measurable in numbers, but always felt in divine favor, protection, and unexpected opportunities. Giving places a person under divine economy, where loss turns into gain and scarcity transforms into abundance. The one who gives consistently and faithfully steps out of the world's system of fear and into heaven's system of harvest. There are people who pray for blessings yet refuse to activate the principle that releases them. They hold tightly what they have, unaware that their closed hand prevents them from receiving what is greater. The open hand of generosity becomes the landing place for God's provision. When a Christian gives, they often declare that God will supply all their needs according to His riches and glory. When a Muslim gives zakat or sadaqah, they believe Allah will replace what was given with something better. The giver does not walk in lack but in the assurance of return. Not always immediately, not always in the same form, but always in accordance with divine wisdom and timing. Giving is an expression of trust in divine provision. It says, my security is not in my possession but in my provider. Both faith traditions emphasize that God is the ultimate source of all sustenance. To give is to acknowledge that you are not the owner, but the steward. When a steward releases resources according to divine instruction, they make room for the master to release more. Many people pray for increase, but remain bound by fear of losing what they have. But when faith drives giving, they enter a supernatural flow where every seed produces a harvest greater than its size. Just as a farmer plants seeds, expecting a field of crops, the spiritual giver gives with an expectation of divine multiplication. Sometimes multiplication does not only manifest in financial abundance, but in spiritual strength, protection, answered prayers, emotional peace, and favor with people. In Christian testimonies, people often speak of unexpected breakthroughs that followed acts of faith-filled giving. In Islamic teachings, sadaqah is said to extinguish calamities and bring blessings to one's home. Giving becomes a shield as well as a seed. It creates a covering of favor and guidance. The act of giving shifts the environment around a person, making way for doors to open that were previously closed. It sends a message into the unseen realm that this person walks by faith, and heaven responds. There are moments in life when giving becomes a test, when resources are low, when needs seem great. That is when giving requires greater faith. But history, testimonies, and sacred texts are filled with stories of those who gave in their moment of lack and witnessed an overflow beyond logic. The widow who gave her last meal to the prophet saw her oil and flour never run out. The believer who paid their zakat, even when finances were tight, saw their needs met in miraculous ways. It is in the moment of sacrifice that multiplication is most powerful. A seed larger in sacrifice yields a harvest larger in blessing. God does not forget the giver who gives in faith, not for recognition but for obedience. Giving also brings a shift in perspective. Those who give regularly begin to think differently about provision. They no longer see scarcity as a threat because they have seen how giving opens doors. They live with expectation, not fear. They operate with gratitude, not greed. They walk with confidence, not anxiety. Their faith grows each time they witness how God multiplies their resources. In this state, giving becomes natural, joyful, and unstoppable. They become channels of blessing, vessels through which divine provision flows to others. As a person continues to give, they step into a lifestyle where they are always sowing seeds and always reaping harvests. Giving becomes a continuous cycle of trust and return. They no longer ask, "What will I lose if I give?" but, "What harvest is coming from this seed?" They understand that every act of giving activates heaven's attention and releases divine increase. They live not by the fear of lack, but by the assurance of supernatural supply. They know that when they give, they do not diminish but expand. They do not lose but gain. They do not scatter but plant. Every act of giving becomes a step toward greater provision, greater blessing, and greater multiplication. True giving is not born out of pressure, but out of compassion. It is not merely a ritual or a religious tick on a checklist, but a movement of the heart that reflects divine love and mercy. When a believer gives only because they are told to, there is no power in that giving. But when they give because their heart is stirred with compassion, that giving becomes fuel for transformation. In Christian teaching, love is the foundation of giving. The scripture says that though one gives all their possessions to the poor but has not love, it profits them nothing. In Islam, while zakat is obligatory, it is meant to purify the soul and cultivate compassion for those in need. The purpose is not just to fulfill a law, but to soften the heart so that generosity flows naturally. Sadaqah, the voluntary charity, is especially revered because it comes from a place of love and empathy, not compulsion. Compassion opens the wellspring of true generosity. When the heart is moved by empathy, it sees beyond numbers and obligation. It sees people, pain, hunger, and need. In Christianity, Jesus is described as being moved with compassion before performing miracles. It was compassion that fed the 5,000. It was compassion that healed the sick and raised the broken. Christianity teaches that when we give to the poor, we are giving to God Himself, because divine love flows toward the broken and needy. In Islam, the one who shows mercy is shown mercy by Allah. The Prophet taught that those who do not show compassion will not receive compassion. Giving rooted in compassion becomes a spiritual heartbeat that aligns the believer with the character of God, who is both giving and merciful. Obligation may initiate an action, but only compassion sustains it as a lifestyle. A person may give once out of duty, but only someone driven by compassion will give repeatedly, joyfully, and sacrificially. In Christianity, cheerful giving is emphasized, for God loves a cheerful giver. The joy comes not merely from following a command, but from being in tune with God's heart for humanity. In Islam, zakat might be a pillar, but the true beauty of giving shines brightest when one goes beyond the obligation and gives out of love in sadaqah. When giving shifts from "I must" to "I want to," it becomes evidence of spiritual maturity and alignment with divine mercy. Compassion transforms giving from a transaction into a connection. It connects the giver with the receiver in a shared moment of grace. It allows the giver to feel the weight of another's suffering and respond not just with material assistance, but with genuine care. This is why Christian teaching emphasizes giving not from surplus alone, but from the heart, following the example of the widow who gave her last 2 coins. Islamic teaching emphasizes that even a smile is charity, because it is an act of kindness that springs from compassion. The value of this type of giving is not measured in the amount given, but in the compassion behind it. Obligation may calculate, but compassion overflows. Obligation asks, "What is the minimum I must do?" Compassion asks, "What more can I do to ease someone's burden?" When someone gives only out of duty, they often give just enough to meet the requirement. But when they give out of compassion, they go beyond the limits of obligation. Jesus praised the Good Samaritan not because he fulfilled a rule, but because he allowed compassion to interrupt his journey and give more than what was expected. Islamic stories tell of those who gave their last pieces of bread to the poor out of love for Allah's approval, demonstrating that compassion fuels sacrificial giving. That obligation alone cannot produce compassion also brings spiritual transformation to the giver. When you give out of duty, you may feel relieved that the requirement is fulfilled. But when you give out of compassion, you feel joy, warmth, and spiritual elevation. In Christianity, giving out of love is seen as participation in God's nature. The more you give with compassion, the more you reflect divine love. In Islam, giving out of compassion purifies the soul, removing selfishness and arrogance. It allows the heart to grow softer, more merciful, and more in tune with divine qualities of kindness and generosity. Compassion-driven giving is not just an action, it is a spiritual journey that changes the inner person. There are times when the law of obligation can discipline the heart to begin giving, but once compassion takes over, that giving becomes a passion rather than a burden. A believer who gives from compassion does not look at the poor with pity, but with brotherhood and shared humanity. They see giving not as charity, but as a duty of love. In Christian teaching, love fulfills the law, and in Islamic teaching, mercy is at the core of faith. When giving is motivated by compassion, it begins to flow consistently and willingly. It becomes not just an act, but a lifestyle where the believer looks for opportunities to give rather than avoiding them. Compassion gives dignity to the receiver. Obligation may distribute wealth, but compassion shares humanity. A giver who is compassionate ensures that their giving does not humiliate but uplifts, giving hope rather than shame. Jesus taught giving in secret to protect the dignity of the poor. Islamic teachings emphasize giving quietly to protect the honor of the receiver. True compassion cares not only about meeting needs, but also about protecting hearts. It gives with humility, knowing that tomorrow the giver could be the one in need. Compassion levels the ground between people, reminding everyone that wealth and position are temporary tests from God. Compassion is what makes giving a divine partnership. It allows the giver to feel the burden of the needy the way God does. It transforms the act of giving into worship. It turns zakat from a rule into a blessing, turns tithes and offerings from a duty into a joyful offering of love. It makes the believer say, I give because I love, because I care, because my heart cannot stay silent in the face of suffering. Compassion makes giving not just something you do, but something you are. You become a vessel of mercy, a channel of provision, a reflection of divine generosity. When giving is driven by compassion, it becomes a force that heals, restores, connects, and blesses both the giver and the receiver, aligning hearts with the ultimate giver. Helping the poor is not just an act of kindness. It is a ladder that lifts the soul higher towards spiritual maturity and divine favor. In both Christian and Islamic teachings, the path to true elevation does not go through pride or accumulation, but through humility and compassion toward those in need. When you extend your hand to the poor, you are not lowering yourself, you are rising toward a higher spiritual plane. To walk in love, generosity, and selflessness is to walk closer to the heart of God. In Christianity, Jesus teaches that when you give to the least of these, you are giving to Him. It means that helping the poor becomes a direct encounter with the divine. In Islam, it is taught that Allah is with those who are humble and merciful, and acts of charity elevate the giver in the sight of Allah. The believer who gives does not just fulfill a duty, they ascend spiritually, becoming a reflection of divine compassion. There is a transformation that happens in the giver when they choose to lift others. Spiritual elevation is not simply about prayer, fasting, or rituals. It is deeply tied to how we treat those who are struggling. In Christian teachings, faith without works is considered dead, and helping the poor is one of the clearest manifestations of living faith. In Islam, a person is not considered righteous if they pray diligently while ignoring the needs of the poor around them. The act of helping the poor awakens a deeper awareness of one's blessings and cultivates gratitude. Gratitude is a key to spiritual elevation because it aligns the heart with divine favor. When a person helps the poor, they begin to see life through the lens of mercy, humility, and thankfulness. And this inner posture leads them higher in spiritual rank. Spiritual elevation is not measured by how high one stands, but by how low one is willing to bend to help others rise. The one who lifts the broken becomes a vessel of divine elevation. In Christianity, the path to greatness is through servanthood, and the one who humbles themselves will be exalted. In Islam, the Prophet taught that the best of people are those who are most beneficial to others. This means helping the poor is not just an option for spiritual growth, but a requirement. When a believer gives food to the hungry or supports the orphan, they are not just giving material assistance, but sowing seeds for spiritual elevation. Heaven takes note of every act of compassion, and each act becomes a step on the ladder of divine promotion. Helping the poor softens the heart and removes spiritual barriers. When wealth and comfort accumulate without being shared, they can harden the heart and create arrogance. But giving to the poor breaks the pride that blocks spiritual elevation. In Christianity, it is taught that pride goes before destruction, but humility brings honor. In Islam, arrogance is a major spiritual disease that blocks access to divine blessings. Helping the poor humbles the giver, reminding them that all they possess is a trust from God. This humility becomes a key that unlocks further spiritual favor and blessings. When the heart is purified from arrogance through helping the poor, it becomes more receptive to divine guidance and wisdom. Helping the poor also brings spiritual elevation because it aligns the believer with the character of God. In Christianity, God is described as a father to the fatherless and a defender of the poor. In Islam, Allah is Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, and Ar-Razak, the provider. When a believer feeds the hungry or clothes the needy, they are acting as instruments of God's mercy and provision. By doing so, they draw nearer to God and reflect His attributes in their actions. The closer you reflect divine qualities, the higher you rise spiritually. Each act of helping the poor is not just a good deed, it is a step toward becoming more like the one who is infinitely compassionate. Spiritual elevation is also tied to the divine reward promised to those who help the poor. In Christianity, there are promises that those who give to the poor will lack nothing. The one who refreshes others will themselves be refreshed. In Islam, there are countless hadith that speak of how those who care for orphans and the needy will be elevated in paradise and placed near the Prophet. The promise of spiritual elevation is both for this life and the next. In this life, the giver experiences increased blessings, inner peace, and spiritual insight. In the next life, they are elevated in rank and rewarded in ways beyond human imagination. Helping the poor becomes a spiritual investment that compounds in eternal reward. There is also a deep sense of spiritual connection that develops when one helps the poor. When a believer provides for someone in need, they begin to understand the heart of God more deeply. They begin to pray not just for themselves, but for others. Their prayers become more compassionate, their worship more sincere, and their gratitude more intense. Spiritual elevation happens when the heart expands in love for others. Helping the poor stretches the heart beyond selfishness, making more room for divine presence. The more room the heart has for compassion, the higher the soul ascends in spiritual illumination. Helping the poor also builds inner strength and resilience. It teaches sacrifice, patience, and trust in divine provision. When a believer gives even in times of personal struggle, they grow spiritually stronger. In Christianity, sacrificial giving is seen as an act of worship that brings powerful spiritual breakthrough. In Islam, giving even when one fears poverty is a sign of profound faith. This sacrificial compassion lifts the believer to higher levels of spiritual maturity. The act of giving stretches faith and builds endurance, qualities that elevate a person spiritually and place them in a higher status before God. There is a divine mystery in the way that lifting others becomes the key to lifting oneself. When a believer spends their time, effort, and resources to help the poor, something shifts in their spirit. They begin to walk in greater peace, greater favor, and greater spiritual awareness. They develop a deeper sense of connection with God and a greater sense of purpose in life. They begin to live not just for themselves, but for something higher. That higher calling becomes the wind that lifts their soul upward. The more they help others rise, the more they themselves rise. The more they pour out, the more they are filled. Helping the poor becomes a stairway that leads the giver into realms of spiritual fullness, divine approval, and eternal elevation.